You know that moment when someone says something so casually cruel that time seems to stop. When the words hit you in front of people you love, and suddenly you're frozen between defending yourself and keeping the peace. That's exactly where I found myself on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, sitting at my mother's dining table with apple pie cooling on the counter and my husband's voice cutting through the comfortable family chatter like a blade. "This is what good wives do," he said, smiling at me like he'd just offered a compliment instead of a command. And in that moment, surrounded by my own family's uncomfortable silence, something inside me made a decision that would change everything. Maybe you've been there too, that specific kind of humiliation that comes wrapped in tradition, disguised as concern, presented as if it's for your own good. The controlling husband who frames every demand as guidance, every criticism as care. The emotional manipulation marriage where you're always walking on eggshells, always performing, always wondering if you're finally being the partner they want you to be. I spent 7 years trying to be a good wife, whatever that meant, shrinking myself smaller and smaller until I barely recognized the woman staring back at me from the mirror. But here's what nobody tells you about toxic marriage stories: they don't end with dramatic confrontations or thrown dishes or screaming matches in the driveway. Sometimes they end with something much more powerful: silence. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of a woman who's finally seen the pattern clearly and decided she's done performing. This is the story of how I stopped being a good wife and started being myself again. And if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, ever wondered if this is really all there is, ever smiled through public humiliation while dying inside, this story is for you. Because the truth is, respect can't be demanded. Love is not obedience. And the most radical thing a woman can do when someone tries to control her is simply, quietly, stop cooperating. This is my family revenge story, my emotional power reversal, my journey from silent shame to fierce clarity. And it started with 4 words at a family dinner that I'll never forget: "This is what good wives do." Spoiler alert, I found out what good wives actually don't. It's nothing like what he expected. Sarah adjusted the salad bowl on her mother's dining table, smoothing down her navy dress one more time. The house smelled like roasted chicken and her aunt's famous apple pie, and laughter spilled from the living room where her siblings gathered. It was supposed to be one of those easy Sunday afternoons, the kind where you let your guard down, share stories, and remember why family matters. She smiled at her husband Michael across the room, expecting maybe a wink, a shared moment of warmth in the comfortable chaos of a family gathering. But there was something in his posture that afternoon, something she couldn't quite name yet. He stood near the fireplace with her father and uncle, drink in hand, nodding along to their conversation about the upcoming election. Sarah felt that familiar flutter of trust, the assumption that your partner has your back even when you're not looking. She'd built this toxic marriage story without realizing it, brick by brick, excuse by excuse. The sense of belonging within her family still felt intact, and she had no reason to suspect that everything was about to shift. Her younger sister Maya was talking about a promotion at work, and Sarah genuinely felt proud. "That's amazing, Maya. You've worked so hard for this," she said, reaching for the wine bottle to refill glasses around the table. The atmosphere was relaxed, full of that particular kind of comfort that only comes from being around people who've known you since you had braces and bad bangs. Nobody was performing here, or so she thought. This was the kind of evening where you could be yourself, where support and respect were givens, not things you had to earn or negotiate. Michael caught her eye again, and this time she saw something she'd been ignoring for months, maybe years. A look that said he was calculating something, measuring the room, preparing. She shook it off, told herself she was imagining things, poured herself another glass of wine. After all, they'd been married for 7 years, and she still believed in the foundation they'd built. She still trusted that when push came to shove, he'd stand beside her, not above her. That trust in marriage, fragile as spun glass, was still somehow intact. The moment came during dessert, when Sarah's mother asked if anyone wanted coffee. Sarah stood up naturally, the way she always did, ready to help clear plates and bring out the dessert cups. But before she could take 2 steps toward the kitchen, Michael's voice cut through the comfortable hum of conversation like a knife through butter. "Sarah, sit down. This is what good wives. Hey, let their husbands decide when it's time to move. The room didn't go silent exactly, but there was a pause, a collective intake of breath that felt like the air itself was reconsidering its options. He said it with a smile, that controlling husband charm had perfected over the years, the one that made cruelty look like concern. His hand gestured toward her chair with the kind of authority you'd use to direct traffic, not address your wife. Sarah's father chuckled uncomfortably, and her uncle raised his eyebrows but said nothing. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Good wives, as if there was a manual somewhere, a rulebook that everyone had agreed to accept her. This wasn't the first time Michael had asserted authority publicly, but it was the first time he'd done it in front of her entire family, wrapping his control in the respectable packaging of tradition. What made it worse was how he framed it. This emotional manipulation marriage technique had clearly been practicing. He wasn't being mean, he was being traditional. He wasn't controlling her, he was guiding their household according to proper values. The good wives manipulation was right there, dressed up in Sunday clothes and passing itself off as moral expectation. Her mother looked down at her plate, and Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that no one was going to challenge him. The silence expected as obedience was already settling over the table like snow, cold and suffocating. Sarah lowered herself back into her chair, and she could feel Michael's satisfaction radiating across the table like heat from a furnace. He'd made his point, established his dominance, and wrapped it all in language that made her look unreasonable if she objected. After all, who argues against being a good wife in front of their in-laws? The control framed as moral expectation was perfect, really bulletproof. He'd found a way to diminish her while making himself look like the reasonable one, the man who just wanted a proper, respectful marriage. And everyone at that table, whether they realized it or not, had just witnessed the public humiliation wife moment that would change everything. The comment landed in front of her family like a stone dropped into still water, and Sarah watched the ripples spread across every face at the table. Her brother-in-law let out an awkward laugh, the kind that tries to break tension but only makes it worse. Her sister Maya's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she looked away, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on her dessert plate. Even her mother, who'd never been shy about speaking her mind, busied herself cutting the apple pie into perfectly equal slices, as if geometry could save them all from this moment. The laughter or silence from others felt like a choice they were making, and they were choosing to let it happen. Sarah felt heat crawling up her neck, that particular shame that comes from being called out in front of people you love. But what stung more than Michael's words was the fact that nobody challenged him. Her father cleared his throat and asked Michael about his golf game. Her uncle refilled his wine glass. The conversation moved on like a stream flowing around a rock, and Sarah was the rock-solid, silent, stuck. This toxic marriage story was being written in real time, and her family was unknowingly signing off on every page. The feelings minimized in that moment weren't just hers, they belonged to every woman who'd ever been told to smile and bear it. She sat there with her hands folded in her lap, the good wife pose that Michael apparently wanted, and felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't dramatic, there were no tears, no outburst, no storming out of the room. Just a quiet, internal breaking, like ice shifting on a frozen lake. The shame without confrontation was almost worse than if someone had yelled. At least anger acknowledges that something wrong has happened. This polite silence suggested that maybe nothing wrong had happened at all. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe this was just how marriages worked, and she needed to accept her role in this dark relationship drama. But even as she smiled and nodded when someone passed her a slice of pie, even as she mechanically lifted her fork and pretended to enjoy the dessert, Sarah was filing this moment away. The public humiliation wife treatment she'd just received wasn't something she'd forget, and it wasn't something she'd forgive easily. Michael had wanted to make a point, to show everyone including her who was really in charge of their marriage. Had succeeded. But what he didn't realize, what nobody at that table realized, was that humiliation has a way of clarifying things. And Sarah was suddenly seeing her marriage, her life, her future with a clarity that was almost blinding. Sarah took a slow sip of her wine and set the glass down with careful precision. Her hand didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver when she said, "You're absolutely right, honey," with a smile that could have been painted on porcelain. Michael looked pleased with himself, vindicated, like he'd just won an argument nobody else knew they were having. Her father resumed his story about the neighbor's new boat, and the dinner continued as if nothing seismic had just occurred. But something had shifted in Sarah, something fundamental and irreversible, and the most dangerous part was that nobody could see it happening. The protagonist stays calm in moments like these, the kind of calm that comes from a decision already made. Sarah passed the cream to her aunt, laughed at her brother's terrible joke about politicians, and asked Maya about her upcoming vacation plans. No argument or explanation emerged from her lips, no defense of her dignity, no lecture about respect in marriage. She'd learned long ago that arguing with a controlling husband in public only gives him another stage to perform on. Instead, she offered composed agreement on the surface, nodding when Michael made another comment about how things should be and even touching his arm affectionately when her mother wasn't looking. What her family saw was a wife who'd accepted her husband's guidance, maybe even appreciated it. What they didn't see was the quiet observation happening behind Sarah's eyes. She was watching Michael now the way a scientist watches a specimen under glass with detached interest and careful notation. How many times had he done this before in smaller ways? How many little comments and corrections had she absorbed, thinking they were normal, thinking all marriages involved this kind of emotional manipulation marriage dynamic? She counted them now, sitting at her mother's table, and the number was staggering. Michael reached for her hand during coffee, and she let him take it, even squeezed back. To everyone watching, they looked like a solid couple, maybe even enviable in their traditional dynamic. But Sarah was done performing. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a fight, wasn't going to let him paint her as the difficult wife who couldn't take a little guidance. No, this silent revenge marriage would be much more effective than any argument could ever be. She'd simply stop playing the role he'd written for her, stop being the good wife he seemed to think he'd created. And she'd do it so quietly that by the time he noticed, it would be far too late to stop the emotional power reversal already beginning in her mind. The drive home was quiet, filled only with the hum of tires on asphalt and Michael's satisfied humming of some tune Sarah didn't recognize. He thought the evening had gone well, she could tell. Had established his authority, reminded everyone of the proper order of things, and his wife had behaved exactly as she should. Sarah stared out the passenger window at the streetlights blurring past, and that's when the pattern of control became clear, stretching back through their entire marriage like a timeline she'd been too close to see. Every decision had made for them, every friend had quietly discouraged her from seeing, every career opportunity had convinced her wasn't worth the stress, it all lined up now with devastating clarity. She thought about the job offer in Boston 3 years ago, the one she'd turned down because Michael said it would be too disruptive to their life together. She remembered her book club that had slowly dissolved after he kept scheduling date nights on the same evening, insisting that their marriage should come first. The realization that good wife means invisible hit her like cold water. She'd been disappearing piece by piece, and she'd helped him do it. She'd thought she was being considerate, flexible, a good partner. But what she'd really been doing was erasing herself to make room for his ego, his needs, his vision of what their life should look like. When they got home, Michael kissed her forehead and said, "See? That wasn't so hard. My parents always said a peaceful home starts with knowing your roles." Sarah nodded, hung up her coat, and went to the kitchen to make his usual nightcap bourbon, 2 ice cubes, exactly the way he liked it. But as she stood there listening to the ice crack in the glass, emotional clarity replaces fear in a way that felt almost chemical. She wasn't afraid of him, not physically. She was afraid of wasting more years playing a character in his personal drama, afraid of looking back at 50 and wondering who she might have been if she'd had the courage to stop performing. The internal break from the role happened right there, standing in her kitchen at 10:47 on a Sunday night, with her husband's bourbon sweating on the counter and her reflection staring back from the dark window above the sink. This female empowerment story wasn't going to be loud or dramatic. There'd be no big speech, no suitcases thrown on the lawn, no Jerry Springer moment for the neighbors to gossip about. Sarah was going to do something much more effective. She was going to simply stop being the wife Michael thought had married. Stop cooking his favorite meals. Stop managing his schedule. Stop shrinking herself to fit his requirements. And most importantly, stop pretending that this toxic marriage story had a happy ending written anywhere in its pages. Monday morning came, and Sarah made coffee for one. Not out of spite, but out of simplicity. She was done anticipating his needs before her own. Michael wandered into the kitchen at his usual time, expecting his travel mug filled and ready by the door, but found Sarah sitting at the table with her laptop, fully absorbed in updating her resume. "No coffee?" he asked, more confused than annoyed. She looked up, smiled pleasantly, and said, "Oh, there's plenty in the pot. Help yourself." The strategic change in behavior started small like that, barely noticeable ripples that would eventually become waves. No announcement, no fight, just a quiet recalibration of who did what for whom. By Wednesday, Michael noticed his dry cleaning wasn't picked up. By Friday, he realized Sarah had made dinner plans with Maya without asking his permission first. Not that she'd ever technically needed permission, but she'd always checked with him anyway, always made sure her schedule aligned with his preferences. "I thought we could try that new Italian place tonight," he said, scrolling through his phone. Sarah didn't even look up from her book. "Sounds great. You should go. I'm meeting Maya at 7. The withdrawal of compliance wasn't aggressive, it was simply absent, like air leaving a room so gradually you don't notice until you're gasping. The following week brought more changes. Sarah stopped managing his mother's birthday gift that could figure out what his own mother wanted. She stopped rearranging her work meetings to accommodate his golf schedule. She stopped laughing at his jokes when they weren't funny, stopped nodding along when he explained things she already understood, stopped performing the emotional labor that had kept their household running smoothly while he took all the credit. This silent revenge marriage wasn't about punishing him, it was about reclaiming herself. Every small act of non-compliance was a brick in the wall she was building between who she'd been and who she was becoming. Michael tried to laugh it off at first, made jokes about her little rebellion phase to their friends. But power begins to shift in marriages when one person stops playing by rules they never agreed to in the first place. Sarah watched it happen with almost clinical interest, the way his confidence wavered when she didn't jump to fix things, the way his irritation grew when she met his demands with polite indifference. She wasn't being cruel. She was just being honest. And honesty, she was discovering, was the most devastating weapon in this emotional power reversal. The controlling husband who'd built his identity on her compliance was suddenly facing a woman who'd stopped caring about his approval, and he had absolutely no idea how to handle it. It took Michael exactly 3 weeks to panic. Sarah came home from dinner with colleagues, a dinner she'd simply announced rather than requested permission for, to find him sitting in the dark living room like some kind of movie villain waiting for the hero. "We need to talk about what's happening to this marriage," he said, and she could hear the attempts to reassert control in every syllable. He used the voice he saved for serious moments, the one that implied he was the reasonable adult and she was the child who needed guidance. But Sarah just kicked off her heels, dropped her purse on the entry table, and asked if he'd eaten, as casual as discussing the weather. The use's guilt came next, layered thick like frosting on a cake nobody wanted. "My mother noticed you haven't been calling her. She's hurt, Sarah. She thinks you don't care about family anymore." Then came tradition, rolled out like artillery. "This isn't how my parents did things. They understood that marriage requires sacrifice, requires someone to lead and someone to support. And finally, authority. I'm your husband. Doesn't that mean anything to you anymore?" Sarah listened to it all while folding laundry, his laundry, ironically, though this would be the last time, and realized she felt nothing. Not anger, not guilt, not even satisfaction. Just a profound, almost peaceful indifference to his performance. By week 5, the confusion when obedience is gone had transformed him into someone she barely recognized. Michael started doing things he'd never done before: loading the dishwasher, picking up his own prescriptions, actually reading the school newsletter about their nephew's play instead of asking Sarah to summarize it. But he did it all with this wounded air, like a king forced to fetch his own water. "I don't understand what you want from me," he said one night, and the loss of dominance was written all over his face. Had built his entire identity around being the leader, the decision-maker, the one who knew best. Without her cooperation, that identity was crumbling like sandcastle at high tide. What Michael couldn't grasp was that this family revenge story wasn't about revenge at all, it was about evolution. Sarah had simply evolved past the role Head assigned her, and he was stuck playing the same character in a show that had been cancelled. He tried everything: flowers, apologies that felt more like negotiations, even suggesting couples therapy, which would have been laughable if it wasn't so sad, considering Head spent years telling her therapy was for people who can't handle their own problems. But Sarah had already made her peace with this dark relationship drama reaching its natural conclusion. She'd stopped being the good wife he demanded, and in doing so, discovered she'd never actually been a bad wife at all. She'd just been married to a man who confused control with love, obedience with respect, and silence with happiness. Sarah signed the lease on her new apartment on a Tuesday morning, and it felt less like an ending and more like finally exhaling after holding her breath for 7 years. The place was small, overlooking a park where joggers passed by at dawn, and it was entirely, beautifully hers. No one to perform for, no script to follow, no audience judging whether she was being a good wife or falling short of some invisible standard. She'd learned the hardest way possible that love is not performance. Real love doesn't require you to shrink, to silence yourself, or to pretend that public humiliation is somehow part of the marriage package. Real love makes space for both people to be fully human, fully flawed, fully themselves. The final conversation with Michael was quieter than she'd expected. He still didn't really understand what had happened, kept asking what he could change, what he could fix, as if she were a problem requiring solution rather than a person requiring respect. "You can't demand it publicly and expect it to mean anything," she told him, thinking back to that dinner at her mother's house, the moment everything crystallized. Respect can't be demanded publicly, it can only be given freely, earned through consistent behavior, protected through mutual dignity. Michael had tried to take it by force, wrapped in the language of tradition and expectation, and lost everything in the process. Her sister Maya helped her move, and over pizza in the empty apartment, Sarah reflected on how roles imposed by shame don't last. You can force someone to play a part for a while, sure. You can use guilt and social pressure and the weight of family expectations to keep them in line. But eventually, the person underneath that role wakes up, looks around, and realizes they've been living someone else's life. The good wife's manipulation only works as long as the wife believes she has no other choice. The moment she sees the exit, the moment she realizes her worth isn't determined by someone else's approval, the whole house of cards collapses. What surprised Sarah most wasn't the difficulty of leaving, but the ease of it once she'd made the decision. Power returns quietly, not with trumpets or declarations, but in small moments of autonomy: making coffee for one, planning evenings without consulting anyone, sleeping diagonally across the bed because she could. This female empowerment story didn't have a villain exactly, just a woman who'd forgotten who she was and a man who'd never bothered to really know her. And now, standing in her new living room with takeout containers and her sister's laughter filling the space, Sarah finally understood that the opposite of a toxic marriage story isn't a perfect one, it's an honest one. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is walk away from a role that was never really yours to begin with. So here's the question I want you to sit with tonight: what role are you playing that was never really yours to begin with? What version of yourself have you been performing because someone else wrote the script and handed it to you with a smile? I'm not saying every uncomfortable moment in a relationship means you need to leave. Relationships are complex, messy, beautiful things that require compromise and growth from both people. But there's a difference between healthy compromise and slow erasure. There's a difference between supporting your partner and disappearing into their expectations. Think about the last time someone made you feel small in front of others. Did you laugh it off? Did you tell yourself you were being too sensitive? Did you go home and try harder to be what they wanted, thinking that if you just got it right this time, the criticism would stop? Here's what I learned in that tiny apartment overlooking the park: eating pizza with my sister and finally breathing freely. You can't fix a relationship where respect only flows one direction. You can't love someone into seeing your worth. And you absolutely cannot perform your way into dignity. Dignity is something you claim for yourself, quietly and fiercely, when you realize nobody else is going to hand it to you. The emotional power reversal in my story didn't happen because I became someone new. It happened because I remembered who I'd always been underneath all that performance, all that shrinking, all those years of trying to be a good wife for a man who confused control with love. And maybe that's your story too. Maybe you're reading this and recognizing yourself in the silent humiliation, the public corrections, the feeling that you're always one mistake away from disappointing someone who's supposed to be on your team. If that's you, if any of this resonates in that uncomfortable way, that means it's true. Then I want you to know you're not crazy. You're not difficult. You're not asking for too much when you ask for basic respect. This female empowerment story, this dark relationship drama that became my real life and then became my freedom, it's not unique. It happens every day in homes that look perfect from the outside, to women who seem like they have it all together, in marriages that everyone assumes are solid. The toxic marriage story you're living doesn't have to be your forever. Power returns quietly when you stop giving it away. Love is not performance, and you are not a role someone else gets to write. So what are you going to do with that information? What's the first small step you can take toward reclaiming yourself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet certainty that changes everything? If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or recognize something you've been avoiding, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. These stories about real people navigating real complications, finding their way from silence to strength, they matter. Your story matters. And sometimes just knowing you're not alone in the darkness is enough to help you find your way toward the light. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's keep telling the truth about what happens behind closed doors, about the quiet courage it takes to stop performing and start living. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear your story too. And maybe, just maybe, we can all learn to recognize our worth before we waste years trying to earn it from people who were never going to give it freely.